It's my pleasure to introduce a wonderful colleague, David Deming. David is the Isabelle and Scott Black Professor of Political Economy, also the Academic Dean of the Harvard Kennedy School, and the Faculty Dean of Kirkland House at Harvard College. He's a research associate at the National Bureau for Economic Research. His research focuses on higher education, economic inequality, skills, technology, and the future of the labor market. David is a faculty lead of the Project on Workforce, a cross-Harvard initiative that focuses on building better pathways to economic mobility through the school to work transition. He recently co-founded the Skills Lab, which creates performance-based measures of soft skills, such as teamwork and decision-making. So thank you, David, for being with us today, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Deb. It's really a delight to be here with all of you. Thank you all for coming. I'm flattered to have so many people here interested in listening to me talk about soft skills. So I'll just get right into it. So this is, as Deb mentioned, my work. I'm an economist, and my work focuses broadly on issues in labor markets and education, particularly at the intersection of those things. And the work that I probably have been most, I guess I would say, intellectually invested in over the last few years is trying to understand what people mean when they talk about soft skills. And it's what I'm going to show you all today is a little bit of the work that I've started to do from the Skills Lab that Deb mentioned. I'm going to show you the results of one paper that we finished and another one that's in progress, and kind of give you a sense for the overall arc of the project. So I'm really excited for that, and I'm going to go through these slides. I don't have too much material. I hope to save plenty of time for questions, and I'm really looking forward to hearing all of your thoughts. So thank you very much. All right, with that intro, let me begin. So soft skills. What do people mean when they talk about soft skills? Well, the first thing I want to do is just step back and say, what are these things? Well, why are they important? Why do they matter? Why am I even interested in spending my scarce time on this? And why are you interested in spending your scarce time on this? And then I want to tell you what I think of as like a new research agenda. And I'm, to be honest, trying to get other people interested in this research agenda, and I think succeeding, to trying to lose the soft in soft skills. So I think basically my thesis statement here is we call them soft skills because we don't really understand what they are, that the term itself reveals the limits of our understanding and our fuzziness about what we mean when we say problem solving or teamwork or decision making or strong work ethic or whatever. And so I want to fix that. And you have to fix that, as a scientist, as a researcher, I want to fix that by taking the soft out of soft skills and being much more conceptually precise when we think about what these things are, and starting to think about ways to measure them, ways to develop these skills that are so clearly important in today's labor market. So I'm going to talk about two areas. This is a broader project, but I'm going to talk about two particular areas today. The first one is teamwork. So how do we know if someone is good in a team? It's a super important thing. Teamwork is kind of ubiquitous, except when you think about like how we assess people in school. I'll pick on my own institution. Like most projects, we have group work, but grades are individual, right? But output in the labor market is not individual. Usually the projects you do are the final product of many people's contributions. And yet if you are an employer and you want to hire somebody, you're going to slot them in to a role on a team. And so how they contribute to teams is a really important thing to know. That's actually kind of a challenging thing to do well. And so I want to tell you about some work that I've done trying to estimate how do you figure out who's a team player, individual contributions to group performance. And then the second thing is a pretty recent project. It's actually something we're about to hit go on, believe it or not, studying decision-making. So what makes somebody good? And when I say decision-making, what I really mean is if you're in a kind of open-ended environment where you're not sure what to do, how do you decide the right course of action? And if you step back and think again about modern work, the kind of, if you think the kind of prototypical job often is like, think about like the assembly line. Okay, so what people call Taylorist job principles, which is like a lot of specialization in your job. Some jobs, you kind of do the same thing over and over and you get better at it. But what really matters is how productive you are. But there are other jobs, like if you're a manager, what are you producing? You're not producing anything, either physical or digital. You're actually deciding how your organization or the people who report to you should spend their time. So your job is basically to allocate resources and to manage people and their personalities and all that, but to allocate resources more efficiently. So I'll talk about a way of figuring out whether people understand how to take some resources and move them around to maximize output. And I'll talk about how we're doing that. That's much more work in progress. Okay, so the first thing is, do team players exist? what makes someone a good team player, and then thinking about good decision-making as a skill, not as a preference or as something that is behavioral, but actually a skill. And I'll get into that more later. Okay, so background. The National Association of Colleges and Employers, or NACE, does a survey every year. This is a screenshot from 2021, but they do this every year, where they survey a bunch of large employers, people who hire college graduates and high school graduates every year. And they say, what are the top things you're looking for when you hire new college graduates? And every year, the same set of skills show up in the top. It's you see like numbers 1 through 5. It's problem-solving skills, ability to work in a team, strong work ethic, some quantitative skills, communication, leadership. So some of these things, like if you look at number 4, analytical and quantitative skills, it's the kind of thing that we select for when we let people into Harvard College. You know, what is your math SAT score? What are your grades in certain subjects? And then there's kind of written communication, your personal essay, and things like that. But a lot of these things are things we don't actually really assess for in school or take that seriously, in particular the first 2, problem-solving skills and ability to work in a team. Now, just as an aside, you might say, well, what does problem-solving skills mean? Let me kind of interpret that the way I think it is that if I want someone who's a good problem solver, what I really want is I tell them, here's a problem I'm having. Now go and find a solution, like be the expert. I don't want to have to tell you, here's step 1, here's step 2, here's step 3. I want to present you with some problem, and then you figure out the route to the solution. So I see decision-making as kind of essential in good problem solving. And this survey is done every year. And actually, moreover, when they ask employers, not just what are you looking for, but what do you think college graduates actually have? They say give college graduates a letter grade on these skills. They tend to give college graduates A's or even A+ sometimes in analytical and quantitative skills. But B- is the average score on ability to work in a team, and B or B+ on problem solving and other things. So employers are clearly speaking, saying these skills are really important to us, and that's what we look for when we hire. And we don't think colleges are doing as good of a job developing them as the more technical, analytical, and quantitative skills. Okay. So what are these things? Well, if you look actually in the data, as an economist, this is my thing. I'm a data guy. There's a very strong association. There's many papers. I omitted the sites to be kind to you, but there's many papers that show a strong just association between earnings, employment, other labor market outcomes, and what economists rather clumsily sometimes call non-cognitive skills, by which they mean everything that's not captured by a test score. Okay, it's a terrible term that I would like to retire, but it's a term that some people use, so I'm going to use it here. So this is just the very beginning of the work on so-called soft skills, which is like, we don't know what it is, but we know what it's not, which is it's not an SAT score or something like that. The other thing that's kind of interesting is that in a lot of data in the US and then in many other countries, Sweden, Norway, other places where they have administrative data like this, there's a repeated pattern, which is that the economic return, meaning like the value in terms of earnings for an additional increment of cognitive skills, meaning like let's just think how well you score on the SAT is a sufficient statistic for this. So the return to that, the value of that in the labor market has actually declined a little bit. Whereas the return to things like, social skills, teamwork, work ethic, however you can measure it, seems to be increasing. And so where does this come from? In Scandinavian countries, it often comes from military records. So everybody is conscripted into the military in some form, every man in many Scandinavian countries. And so they give you a test, like an academic test like the SAT, or the Armed Forces Qualifying Test is what it's called in the US. And then they also administer an interview. A trained psychologist administers an interview and rates you on a bunch of things like, does this person have high character? Do they have good work ethic? Are they a good leader? So it's subjective, but it's got a rigorous protocol. They find that score has become more important over time, and your score on the qualifying test, the academic exam, has become less important. So this is a repeated pattern in recent years. It also turns out, if you just look at data from the US, almost 80% of employment in the US is in occupations where, according to a survey administered by the Department of Labor called the ONET, it's either very important or extremely important to work with others in a group or in a team. So teamwork is really ubiquitous. And then some work I've done a few years ago on social skills, showing that basically jobs that require high levels of social interaction and teamwork have grown a lot as a share of all jobs in the US economy, and they pay relatively higher wages since about 1980. I'll show you some evidence on that in a second. And then finally, some kind of examples from another recent paper I wrote about growing demand for worker autonomy. So hiring people to kind of make open-ended decisions, be problem solvers. Okay, so here's some of the evidence. This is from this 2017 paper I wrote. What is this? This is showing you the change in employment relative to 1980 for 4 different types of jobs. It's just something really simple. You just classify jobs according to that ONET survey I mentioned earlier, which is a survey of job characteristics, and say jobs are either above average or below average in the intensity with which they require quantitative reasoning or mathematical reasoning, and above and below average in the extent to which they require social interaction. So you've got low or high, math or social. So what you see is this orange line, which is jobs that are high in both, jobs that require both quantitative reasoning and teamwork, have grown by about 7 percentage points as a share of all jobs in the US economy since 1980. It's a huge change. And if you look at the red line, which is jobs that don't require that much quantitative reasoning, but also require teamwork, those have grown by about 3 percentage points as a share of all jobs in the US economy. So take that, sum those 2 lines together, what you get is that jobs that require teamwork have grown by more than 10 percentage points since 1980 as a share of all jobs. So a huge compositional shift in the kinds of jobs in the US over the last several decades. And if you see that green line, that includes a lot of so-called STEM jobs. People talk about them a lot, but actually the share of engineers, for example, in the US, engineers has shrunk by a couple of percentage points as a share of all jobs in the US economy. So a stylized way to think about this as the day of, quantitative reasoning is still important, but the days of kind of marching away on a computer or with a calculator or whatever, like doing your own quantitative thing in your office without interacting with others are kind of over. That actually the way to get ahead in today's economy is to be good in a team and to be good at quantitative reasoning both. And you might say, well, maybe this is a supply effect, right? So it's hard to find people to fill those jobs. But actually, this is the same plot, and same colors, but for wages rather than employment. You see, actually, it's the social skill intensive or the teamwork oriented jobs that are paying relatively higher wages over this period too. So as an economist, I say when supply, meaning employment, and demand, meaning wages, are moving in the same direction, that suggests there's something going on, right? Which is that there's an increasing demand for teamwork and social skills or the ability to work in a team in the US economy. Same thing for decision-making. This is kind of this is a figure that took months to stitch together. But it's basically this solid line is from a really cool data set where they went back to 1940 and scraped the actual text of classified ads that have been digitized. And this is Attalay and co-authors, Attalay et al. And they said, okay, what are the things that employers want? Going all the way back to 1940. And I did something really simple, and they posted their data online, so I used their data. And I did something really simple, which is of all the jobs that are posted, what share ask for something like decision-making or problem solving or some keyword that is associated with decisions? And then I compiled that from 1960 to 2000 in their data. That's newspaper classified ads. And then there's kind of interregnum in the 7 years where online job vacancies are not that common and classified ads are dying out. But then you start in 2007, and I collaborated with a company called Burning Glass Technologies that scrapes digital job ads and did the same thing, same keywords, different data source, and you see the same pattern, which is basically the share of all job vacancies that require workers to make decisions in some way has gone from about 5% in 1960 to almost 35% today. Okay. So hopefully that convinces you this is important. So what's the research agenda? Well, I think, again, the term soft skills reveals our lack of understanding, and I want to change that. So first thing I want to do is change the terminology. So what I want to call them is not soft skills, but higher order skills. And the reason for that follows from a very old, and if any of you in the webinar in the room are teachers, you will recognize Bloom's taxonomy of learning objectives. This is one of the foundations of teacher education, which is the hierarchy of learning objectives, which I'll show you in a second. So that's Bloom's taxonomy. It's almost 70 years old now, but I think it's really important for understanding this. If you think about how people are assessed in school, or like when you take the SAT, or you take a college entrance exam of some other kind, what are you being asked to do? It's mostly things at the bottom of the pyramid. Recalling facts, the definition of vocabulary words, basic concepts, define, duplicate, list, memorize, repeat, and state. Maybe it's at the second level, reading comprehension, right? Reading a short passage and understanding it, right? But almost everything on the SAT or on some other high-stakes entrance exam that people all around the world take, almost everything is at the bottom 2 levels of the pyramid. But as you move up the pyramid, you see where problem solving and teamwork and other soft skills start to become more important. Using information in new situations, problem solving, right? Taking something you learned, memorized maybe, and relating it to some new situation that wasn't foreseen. Drawing connections, creativity, counterfactual reasoning, working with others who have different perspectives, understanding how their perspective relates to yours, and figuring out how you can put your knowledge together to produce something new. These are higher order skills. So that's my first foray into this. I want to call them higher order skills, and I think you should too. So here's two challenges for understanding higher order skills. First is conceptual clarity. What do we actually mean by these terms? How would we know whether somebody's better or worse at teamwork or problem solving? And I think the second thing, which is if we could all agree on what it is, how do we measure it? I think when you look at the state of this research, it's pretty poor, and I include some of my own past work in that. We typically will just take whatever happened to be on a survey, slap non-cognitive skills or soft skills as a label on it, and just ask what it's correlated with. And it's not designed in any way purposely for the task at hand, which is conceptual clarity, building a science of soft skills. So that's what I want to change. And that means you got to go into the lab and create new measurements. So that's the first project. That's my first project, is creating a new measurement. This was our first foray. This is a project co-authored with my PhD student, now director of the Skills Lab, Ben Weidman. So do team players exist? What makes someone a good team player? Well, if you look at the evidence, first, especially for complicated tasks, there's pretty good, maybe I don't need to convince you all, but there's pretty good evidence that teams work better than people operating in isolation, especially when things get complicated. There is some evidence out there on how people affect each other, which isn't exactly teamwork. It's kind of like spillover. So this is a really nice paper that shows that if you are a supermarket checkout clerk and you're working at some pace, which is like your productivity, and the person next to you is working faster, you work faster, right? So that's a spillover of one person onto another person's individual productivity. And there's lots of other studies like that, which say, like, if you're around productive people, you become more productive. That's not exactly teamwork, because it's really about, if there's some job where you can measure individual productivity, then you can see how one person affects another. But it doesn't, there are only very few jobs actually where you can measure someone's individual contribution in an atomistic kind of way. There's also a lot of studies in the organizational psychology literature and in economics on the determinants of team success. So what is it about the composition of a team that makes it work better? What about gender balance? What about conversational turn taking? What about psychological safety? There's a huge literature on the effectiveness of teams. That's also not what the study is about, because that's taking the team as the unit of analysis. The thing that I'm interested in is, are some people good team players? Meaning, if you take a team and take its function for granted, and you take David Deming off the team and put Deb Isles on the team, is the team going to be worse or better? Is it going to work more smoothly or less smoothly? And it's a complicated problem, because it depends a lot on what the team's doing, first of all. So if you have a team that's playing chess together against another team, and you remove David Deming, who's okay at chess, but not so great, and add a chess grandmaster to that team's going to perform better. But not because the chess grandmaster is necessarily a great team player in general, rather because they're great at chess, right? So you have to kind of ask across different things, like isolating the contribution of this person to whatever the task is. Do they make a group work better? Do they communicate well? Do they understand how they fit into a team where people have different strengths and weaknesses? That's a kind of general skill. It's not about just being good at whatever the task is. So that's what we're after today. So this is a paper we published a couple of years ago in a journal called Econometrica. I'll spare you all the econometrics and try to focus on the intuition. So again, we're about introducing a new way to measure an individual's contribution to team performance. The key to that is, so if you know anything about research design, random assignment is really important. But random assignment actually isn't enough in this case. And that's because if you make a team and you randomly assign David Deming, Erica Lane, Laura Similaris, and Deb Isles to that team, and the team does really well, is it because of David? Is it because of Deb? Is it because of Erica? Is it because the four of them get along so well? They have great chemistry? You don't really know. That's an identification problem in the parlance of economics. You can't isolate the individual contribution. But if you create a bunch of different teams and you randomly assign David Deming to all of them, some of those teams are going to do well, some of them aren't. And if every time you assign David Deming to a team, the team improves or the team gets worse, then you can learn over repeated assignments whether David is a good team player or not. So intuitively, what you need is repeated random assignment of individuals to groups. The second thing you need is this chess grandmaster example I brought up, which is you need to know how good David is at the task. And you need to kind of condition that out. So if he's really bad at this thing, then you're going to expect that on average, he's going to make the team kind of worse at it just because he's bad at it. And so you kind of want to control for that and say, well, if sometimes he's really good and sometimes he's really bad, if you keep adding him to teams where he's either above or below the mean of the group, is he still making the group better even after accounting for his performance overall and the performance of the rest of the team? Okay, so there's some math behind that, but that's the intuition. So here's what we do at a high level. First, we measure individual performance on a bunch of different tasks. These are things that can be done individually, but they can also be done in groups. So in step one of the experiment, we say, we're going to give you a bunch of individual assessments and figure out how good you are at these different things. Then we're going to take you in step two, and we're going to randomly assign these participants who have already gone through step one to groups. And we're going to make the groups do kind of group analogs of the individual tasks. And that's important because we sort of know how good each person is individually, so we can make a prediction about how good the group is going to be based on the assignment of people to that group. So like I know how good each of you is at chess, and if I put you on a chess team together, we can predict how well the team's going to do. And then what happens is sometimes the teams do worse, and sometimes they do better than the prediction. Right? That's life. There's noise. You can't perfectly predict anything. And so the question is, if your group always outperforms its prediction when you are randomly assigned to the group over multiple assignments, then you are a team player. Okay, what that means is every time I put Deb on the team outkicks its coverage. The team does better than you would predict based on the team's ability on this task. What that says is Deb's a great communicator. Deb's a great leader. She gets people motivated to do the task. She says, look, I'm good at this. You're good at that. Let's divide and conquer. Whatever it is that's required, she helps the team figure out how to maximize its productivity. And if every time you assign David to a team, the team does really poorly, he's combative, he always thinks he knows the right answer, he dominates the conversation, he makes everybody demotivated, etc. And that kind of skill or lack of skill is independent of each person's ability to do whatever the tasks are. So that's why we have multiple tasks and multiple assignments. Okay? So, and that's our definition of team player. And again, there's a bunch of math behind that, but that's the intuition, at least my best attempt to explain it. And another kind of nerdy research thing here is that this is a pretty non-standard approach. And so you might worry that we ran this experiment 20 times and only reported the results that turned out in our favor. And so to avoid that problem, what we did was we wrote down, we committed ourselves to a research plan. Here's how we're going to do the random assignment. Here are the tasks. Here's the group size. Here's how we're measuring the team player effect. We set all that in advance, and then we submitted it as something called the American Economic Association Trial Registry. We wrote down a document that said, this is what we're doing. This is our key test. These are our hypotheses. And we submitted it ahead of time. Then we ran the experiment, and we just reported what we did in advance. So you know this doesn't suffer from the so-called file drawer problem, which means I ran 20 studies and I only published the one that looked good. Okay. So here's how it works. Again, just a high level, just to give you a more intuitive sense, more detail. We test individual skills on a bunch of things, this thing called the shapes task, which is almost like a nonverbal IQ test. Something called optimization, where you have to figure out the maximum of a function, and then memory. And again, these are things that could be done in group or individually. We give people a questionnaire that asks them about their personality. If you know the Big Five personality inventory, we give that. And then we give them something called the reading the mind and the eyes test, which I'll tell you more about later. It's a widely used test of emotional perception and sometimes emotional intelligence, people call it. And then we bring people into the lab. This was pre-COVID, actually, so in person in a lab, and we repeatedly randomly assign them to these teams in lab sessions. So this is how it worked. You complete the test individually, and then you get assigned as a group. Okay, so it's about 255 people assigned to 343 unique teams. The study sample is kind of like what you would expect. It's about half, Harvard affiliates, convenience sample in a lab, and half Cambridge residents. It's a bit younger and more racially diverse than the US, but otherwise pretty similar. Okay, so what is it? Again, I'm just going to kind of state it again. It's calculating this effect as we measure group performance. And then we ask, did the group under or overperform its prediction for any one instance? And then across any individual's multiple teams to which they were randomly assigned, did your team consistently overperform or consistently underperform the prediction? Okay. And if yes, you're a team player, congratulations. You won the game. So the other thing that's kind of, again, nerdy is how do we know that this isn't just random chance? Like there's going to be some variation across these assignments and people anyway. How do we distinguish it from just random chance? To do that, we did something which I think is kind of cool. You may think is boring, but we did something called randomization inference, which is we said, okay, we know what the true assignments were. And what we do is we take our data and we simulate 5,000 fake assignments. We say, well, even though we know that on team one was David, Erica, and Laura, let's pretend it was, Laura, Deb, and Erica or something else, right? Some other group of people. And then we say, well, if those were fake assignments, we can calculate a team player effect for fake assignments. And that ought to be 0 because they weren't actually on a team together. And then we ask the question, well, how often is our real assignment different from the fake assignments? And that actually gives us an exact answer to how likely it is that our effect is different from chance. Okay. So that's what this is. P equals 0.029 means our real effect was bigger than 97.1% of the fake ones, which means we think it was real. Okay, that's all. If you're into stats, this will be interesting to you. If you're not, I can just skip over it. But basically, this was our, I think, pretty foolproof way of convincing people there's a real effect here, which is that some people really are reliably contributing to teams more than others. Now you might be interested in who are those people? Who are the team players? Well, let me show you what it was correlated with and what it wasn't. So on the left-hand side, what I'm showing you is a scatter plot of the relationship between the Raven score, which is nonverbal IQ, and the team player effect. There's no association between those. So there's no relationship between IQ and whether you're a team player. The right-hand side, however, shows you people's scores on this thing I mentioned earlier called the reading the mind in the eyes test, which is a widely used measure of emotion perception or emotional intelligence. And there we find a significant positive correlation between your score on this test and whether or not you are a team player. What is this test? It's 26 items, just like this. So you are shown a picture of people's eyes, reading the mind in the eyes, and you have to correctly identify the emotion that they're expressing. So this test, and actually turns out it was originally developed by a well-known autism researcher named Simon Baron-Cohen, was developed to diagnose people with high-functioning autism and Asperger's syndrome. But turns out to have predictive power, for a wide variety of things, including whether you're a team player or not. Okay. So the other thing is, if you're interested in personality, none of these things, like whether you're agreeable, whether you're conscientious, whether you're an extrovert, none of them predicted the team player score. Neither did any demographic characteristics, gender, education, race, age, nothing. So kind of a cool result. Couldn't have honestly worked out any better, in my opinion, which is the only thing that turns out to predict whether you're a good team player is emotional perceptiveness. All right. And the last thing we did, which is kind of cool, is we said, okay, now we know who these people are. So we're gonna, in an out of sample sense, give them a new task and see if when you put a bunch of people on the same team who we think are team players, do they do better in some new task? It turns out that they do. The last thing about that's kind of important, you might say, well, how big is this effect? Is it big or small? Well, actually, it turns out to be about as predictive as IQ, as predicting performance on the team. In other words, if I could give you somebody who's kind of 50% smarter or a 50% better team player and add them to your team, those two people would contribute about the same to your group. So that's pretty, to the extent that we think IQ, whatever that is, matters, being a good team player matters just as much. Okay. That's the team player effect. Next, I want to talk about decision-making, and this is much more work in progress, but I hope you'll find it interesting. So one of the things that I think is interesting about the way researchers anyway talk about decision-making is we sometimes think about it as a preference. We sometimes are people's preferences for certain things. Sometimes we think about them as biases and sometimes skills. What do I mean by that? Well, one way to think about this, and you may have heard the research by Angela Duckworth and others on grit. So the way we conceptualize grit is the ability or the capacity to persevere through effortful tasks to achieve a long-run outcome. That is, I believe, Angela Duckworth's definition of grit. Now, the question is, where does this come from? Now, one place you might think it comes from is preferences, well, sometimes people call it time preferences, which is like, how much do I care about the future versus today? And there's a lot of work on cultural origins of patience or time preferences, like how much do I discount the future How much do I think about the future relative to today? Am I willing to delay gratification and so on? And, people, I know with my own children, I try to teach them to delay gratification. I think of it as some kind of like thing that you develop, think the preference you have. I care about tomorrow, I care about today. And the way, and that's important because if you think about, if we want to build grit, how do we do it? Well, a big category of interventions is so-called growth mindset, which is, adopted in a lot of classrooms these days. Carol Dweck is a big believer of growth mindset, and I think it's a great thing, but there's a kind of implicit theory behind it, which is that the way you activate people to be grittier is to change their beliefs about the returns to their effort. So you say to them, look, think about the long run. You can do more than you think. Your ability is not fixed. Instead, you have the ability to grow. So if you think about what it will be like to grow, you will become grittier. So that's why I say that's kind of like a preferences mindset, because the way you're trying to change people's actions is by changing their beliefs about whether they can benefit from more effort. So it's not about a skill that you have or don't, or that you can build with practice. It's changing somebody's mindset. And I cite this Yeager and Dweck study because a big meta-analysis of growth mindset studies, one of them done by one of my former students, Ali Ghanimian, shows basically no effect of growth mindset in the long run. There's an alternative way of thinking about this, which is what a recent study calls cognitive endurance, which is the ability or the skill of maintaining focus over time. So what this study did was they said, look, let's take a bunch of kids in an Indian primary school, and let's, as part of their regular curriculum, let's actually make them do some really boring but effortful tasks like rotate shapes or fix typos in a paragraph or something, which seems like a terrible thing to do to kids, honestly, but they did it. And what they found, and this is unrelated to the academic curriculum at all, but they said, like, for an hour, we're going to do this really boring thing. And what they found was when they did that for some kids, it improved their performance on academic subjects that they actually weren't exposed to. So like they did better on the math test and the reading test because they spent an hour effortfully practicing something that required focused attention for a long period of time. And the cool thing about the study is they showed those gains came from performance at the end of a test. So those children did the same as the kids in the control group who didn't receive this intervention in the first half of the test. But at the end of the test, they were able to maintain concentration and focus for longer. They were able to be grittier and get the test done and score higher on the test. And so what that tells me is that an alternative frame for grit is actually the skill of maintaining focus is something that can be developed and practiced and improved upon, which is different than a mindset intervention. So I pick on this example, not to pick on growth mindset, because I actually think that is an important thing to have, but to point out that these distinctions actually matter. And this is exactly the kind of thing that as researchers or as people who care about soft skills, we ought to be focused on. This is the conceptual precision that I'm after with soft skills, which is this something that is about a mindset, or is it something you can build with practice? Is it like sports or like something else, practicing the violin or the piano where you just do it more and you get better at it? I think it's the latter. And I think the same applies to decision-making. So another way to think about it is like, look, some decisions are really complicated, right? There's a lot of moving parts. Like, should I take this job at Harvard or should I go to some other place? Should I move home to be closer to my family or not? Like, there's so many factors. Should I go to one college or another college? Should I accept this promotion or not? That it's easy. And you might think, well, people make decisions based on their preferences for things. That's definitely true. But another big limitation in a lot of decision-making in life is just information processing constraints. Like, how do you make sense of the volume of information that's coming at you? How do you strategically use your attention? And that's the thing that I'm after. And that's the thing I think could actually improve decision-making. Helping people strategically use their attention and focus on the right things. All right. So here's the way we're after that. So we developed something we call the assignment game. Here's how it works. In the experiment, you are a participant and you are a manager, and you can assign fictional workers to jobs. And your task is to say, okay, well, if I've got 3 different jobs and 3 different workers, let's say, one of them is really good at task A, not so good at task B, and good at task C. And the other ones, maybe it's the opposite. Like, there is some assignment of workers to tasks that maximizes the total output. Can I get there? So the way we do this is we say, okay, I'm going to show you sorry to pick on you guys, but let's use Laura, Deb, and Erica, workers 1, 2, and 3. I observe them and how good they are at jobs A, B, and C for a week, day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, and day 5. Okay, so I see kind of 5 draws from some distribution, if you like, of how good they are at something. And then it's my task to choose the assignment. So based on what I observed for those 5 days, I'm going to assign Laura to job A and Deb to job C and Erica to job B, or whatever it is. Okay, and then I'm going to get paid. I'm going to get points for making better assignments. So it's important to pay attention. And then we carefully vary the incentives. So like some things are worth more and less. So it might be that like the difference in productivity on job A is huge. Some people are really good and some are not so good. And then in job B, it kind of doesn't matter. Everyone's the same. Okay, and then we can do 3 by 3, or we can do 4 jobs and 4 workers, or 5 and 5, and we can make the differences small or large. You can make this problem trivial or impossible, or at least impossible to maximize on. Okay. And so the question is, do people account for that variation? Do they understand how it bounces around? And do they notice comparative advantage? Like suppose there's a worker, like let's say that Laura's good at everything and David's good at nothing. Well, actually in those cases, it doesn't matter who you assign them, what task you assign them to, because they're good at everything. So it's actually the people who are good at some things and bad at others where it's important to pay attention. So there's absolute advantage, which is some people are good at everything and some are good at nothing, and comparative advantage. And that's a really important principle. So again, what are we trying to do? Well, we're showing people a bunch of information at once, and they can't pay attention to everything. And this problem can get really difficult. And the task is to strategically decide what to pay attention to in order to maximize your output. Again, this seems very abstract, but we think it's getting at the root of what makes somebody good at decision making, which is what should I actually ignore and what should I pay attention to if I can't pay attention to everything? So here's how it works. And I should say, this is again, like in the field, but we have very promising early results suggesting that people who occupy managerial positions and other jobs where you have to make a lot of decisions seem to be scoring higher on this game. And that's true overall, but also after controlling for other things like, IQ and numeracy and things like that. Okay, but that's still TBD. Here's how the game works. So participants first see, and these are actual screenshots from the game, by the way. So participants first see workers one at a time. So I'm just showing you one thing, but I would show you day 1, worker 2 is like task ABC. It's like 3, 4, 6, and then 6, 5, 3, and 4, 2, 4, or whatever. Like we're just showing you a bunch of values for each person over 5 days. Then we show you all of them. So you saw 1, you saw 2, you saw 3, then you see all of them. So you see the whole matrix for 5 days. And then you can assign workers anytime. So here's the assignment window. It's right to the right of this. So you're seeing these things back here flash across the screen, and you can say, okay, I want to assign worker 1 to task A or B or whatever. And you can only assign each worker to 1 task. And then there's a review period at the end where you have to make a choice. Who's going to get assigned to what game? And you have a limited amount of time to do this. Sorry, who's going to be assigned to which task? Okay, and again, you can see how this could be really hard or really easy. And so then what we do is, the way we compute the score is we average over those 5 days, and then you get a score and you get paid based on your assignment. So in this fictional example here, you can look at worker 1, the person assigned 10, 2, and 4. They actually could have done a bit better, right? How? Well, they could have actually noticed that worker 1 worker 3 is the best at task C. So we really want worker 3 to do task C because there are 7 versus 4 and 3 other 2. So you pick 7 for that one. And the other 2 workers, it doesn't matter so much. So you end up making worker 1 do task A and worker 2 do task B. So that's actually the way you maximize this. The ceiling of this is 18, and the person actually scored only 16 because they didn't make the optimal assignment. And then I would say floor, what this really means is actually the way we think about scoring this is like, if you just randomly guess, what's the score you would get? And so people get points for basically doing better than random guessing, all the way up to the maximum they could get. So that's how the game works. And then we have another game that we're showing you that it's a little bit more complicated for me to show you, but where we actually ask people, if anybody here knows what a Trello board is, this is like a productivity software where you have to basically you have a bunch of tasks and a bunch of people and you assign them and you try to figure out like what is the rate limiting step for some project getting done. So we built a more realistic versions, kind of like this, where we say to people, okay, here are some fictional workers, assign them to tasks, and they take a period of time to do it, and you get paid for how many projects you complete. So it's much more like a real project management task than this is, but it's the same underlying skill. And then we are correlating that with things about them, the job they work in, their resume, other history, what they're paid, and things like that. So that's in progress, and I hope to have more information about it soon, and I'll tell you about it. 1 second. So next steps on this, and then I'll take questions. I think these are just two examples. Like I really hope that the outcome of this webinar and the outcome of the work that I'm doing on this is that 10 years from now or 20 years from now, somebody will laugh derisively at the primitive nature of our experiments. But that is my hope, because I don't think that what we're measuring is anything like the complexity that people have in mind when they say, I want a good problem solver or a good team player. Like I definitely recognize that these assessments are rudimentary compared to the complexity of what's actually required. But I think, you have to start somewhere. And that's how science works, is that people will build on this work, and I'm giving you something to argue with. So if you say, actually being a good manager isn't just this, it's this other thing, well, let's build on that. Let's develop an assessment of that. Let's see whether you're right. And that's how science works. So you got to start somewhere, and I think that's where I'm starting. Instead of just having the same vague conversations about soft skills, I want to push the envelope. So this project is funded in part by a 2-year, $1.5 million gift from Schmidt Futures and other sources. And this is the Harvard Skills Lab, and there's a link there, but we can send it later. Or you can just go to Harvard Skills Lab, skillslab.harvard.edu. We're trying to replicate those settings. We're interested in the diversity and teamwork, different aspects of all this stuff. We're doing a lot of other experiments that I'd be happy to tell you about in the Q&A or some other time. Just to recap, the first experiment shows how employers and others can accurately identify team players. So we've been contacted by employers and other people who are interested in trying to put this in practice. We've built a scalable, modular, and web-based application that will basically take a group of people and do the random assignment and figure out for you who's a better team player, if that's something you're interested in doing. And then we hope that's an input into actually building the skill of being a good team player. So we don't just want to identify people, we want to actually develop the skill. But in order to develop it, we have to know what it is. So the second experiment is about decision-making skill. I will say we're soon going to have a public version of this game that I showed you about that anyone can play. And so if you're interested, you can follow me on Twitter. That's my best way to distribute this. That's my Twitter handle. And if you follow me, I will post a link on my account when the site's public, and we welcome anybody to log in and play the game. You can see how you score, and we're planning to build a fun online tool to expose people to this. So stay tuned on that. Hopefully it won't be too long. And so again, I'm hoping that this is the science, this is kind of the basic research arm, and then I hope there'll be a bunch of applications to policymaking, training, and development. And for all of that, you can check out the project on workforce at Harvard that Deb mentioned at the beginning. So with that, I want to thank all of you guys for your time, and I'm very happy to take questions. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, David. You can continue to submit questions via the Q&A. I'm going to group a couple that came in together. So they're a little related here. So is it better to have players on the team who are specialists and perform a certain task really well, or is it better to have players who are good at multiple skills? And then a second part that came in from someone else, how about the motivational component? To your example, if Laura has lost motivation for task A, but is highly motivated for task B, even if she's not the best at it.
Great questions, both of them. So on the first question about specialists, I think we don't really know the answer to that question. We tried to look at the data retrospectively to see, like, are there people who are, particularly good at some things? And actually, I was really interested in that because in principle, one of the ways you could be really good on a team is understanding how to fit in with others. So like the example I give sometimes when I talk about this is, if I was going to write a paper with another colleague, we would arrive at some division of labor, like who's going to, do the framing and motivation, who's going to do the data work. And if I were writing a paper with my grad school advisor, Larry Katz, we would make some division that would be very different than if I was writing a paper with one of my grad students, in terms of who's up to the frontier on the right way to analyze data and who understands the big picture, has been working in the field for a long time, and so on. And so I think there's a lot of real world analogs with that, which is like, if you are a person who every time you join a team, you do the same thing, you're like, this is what I'm good at, I'm doing this, and everybody get out of my way, you're not a good team player, because there might be somebody on the team who's better at that thing than you are, and you need to get in where you fit in, so to speak. And so I think a big part of that skill is, given your own skills, do you have the kind of capacity to understand how they fit in with others? Because you have to, and that's a really complicated cognitive thing. Like, what are these people bringing to the table? What am I bringing to the table? How do I contribute? And so my sense is that people who are specialists are, on average, worse team players, not because there's something wrong with being a specialist, but because the kinds of people who specialize in one thing tend to get blinders about what it is that they do well, which is not what you want in a group dynamic. You want somebody who's more flexible. So I think generalists are probably better. The second question was about, I'm sorry, Erica, what was the second part of the question? I got so
It
upset.
was about motivation. So,
Motivation. Yeah. So we did a cool thing, which is one thing we found was that, so there's one of the tasks in the team player study that the memory task, where there's basically, you have to memorize shapes, some shapes and some, a story, and then some words. And so like, if I were on the team, I would know like, okay, I personally am pretty good at words, but I would be terrible at the shapes. And so like the main thing the team does is they divide it up. So actually they had their own computers and you work together, but they would say, okay, you'll do this one, I'll do this one. And then they would do it independently. And one thing we found was that team players made their teammates score higher on the other subtests in the memory section, even though they didn't work together directly. So what that suggests to me is that part of the way people become better team players is by getting their team motivated or not demotivating their teammates. So basically getting, at the end of the day, you're sitting here in a lab, you're getting paid a little bit of money, but it's like probably kind of boring. And so if you have a person on your team you're excited to work with, they're like, come on guys, let's go, let's do it. You would probably try harder. Whereas if the people are just unpleasant or they don't care, they're, checked out on their phone, whatever, then maybe you wouldn't care as much. So I do think motivation is a big part of what's going on here. And on our to-do list for future work, it's try to unpack some of these mechanisms in more detail.
Great. Similarly, I think along the same lines, what techniques can be used to help individuals become aware of their own biases and limitations in a negative environment? And how can they protect themselves from the Dunning-Kruger effect in that environment?
Yeah, that's great. I don't think I have a bulletproof solution to that. And I think that's part of my own practice, to be honest with you. But I do think that, psychologists call the concept theory of mind, which is almost literally, can you walk a mile in another person's shoes? Can you put yourself inside their mind and think how they think? And I think that's a critical life skill, but it almost certainly has to be one that is built through training, practice, and experience. So I think what I tried to do, and I've tried to be honest, ever since I had children, that gave me higher theory of mind, because all of a sudden my life's not about me, it's about someone else. So I think that helped me a lot personally. But part of it is just the daily practice of not centering yourself. And I think sometimes we get that. Some people are definitely differ in their natural ability to do that. There's no question, based on my own personal experience. But I think also how you organize your life and who you're obligated to and what kind of job you're in and what's required has a big impact on how much you exercise your theory of mind muscles. And there's a lot of research suggesting that, for example, people who are oppressed, people from marginalized groups, people who are subordinate in a hierarchy are more attuned to others because they have to be. And so I think there's just a lot of suggestive evidence that this is sort of like academic achievement or whatever you want to call it, something that like there are individual differences, but how you spend your time and how you build the skill matters a ton too. So I think it just has to be that the more time and attention you pay to building your theory of mind, the better it will get. And actually, interestingly, this autism researcher I mentioned, Simon Baron-Cohen, has built a program to help people who have high-functioning autism sort of train themselves to have the same explicit reaction to others' emotions that others of us have implicitly. So like these theory of mind things I showed you, they're actual, like you can use them like flashcards, and you can train people who are born without the capacity to easily recognize this. Like, hey, when someone furrows their brow, it might mean that they're worried, or it might mean that they want to know more. Like you can actually help people recognize emotions through explicit training. And of course, this is what he did for children and adults with autism, but like, I think it could potentially be broader. Like, and that's kind of like my hope with all this, is that we understand these skills are important. And we privilege them more in educational conversations. And maybe the world will be a better place if we all have better theory of mind.
Great, thank you. Question from, it sounds like a manager side. How can one be a good decision maker in a constrictive bureaucratic environment where you know that your considerations and suggestions may only be weighed if they benefit higher ups? So it's a middle manager question, I think.
Definitely. Yeah, it's a great question. I'm not really sure. That's almost like a question for your pastor or your therapist rather than your resident economist here. But I do have sympathy for it. I mean, I think, look, part of the design of a good leader is to set the conditions up so that people can build their own decision-making skills. So I don't want to say that I have this figured out, but like when we run this thing, the project on workforce I mentioned, like I tried very hard I'm an academic. I got where I am based on my ability to do research. There's no guarantee that any of us are good managers, and many of us aren't, and I'm probably not either. But I'm trying to be cognizant of that, and I try very hard not to micromanage people. And I think that's important to develop leadership skills in people. And the more we think about this as something that's you're not born with it. So again, growth mindset. Like if I had this mental model of the world where you're either a good manager or you're a bad manager, well, I just want to figure out how the good people are and slot them into the system and go. But actually, I think you want to develop people. Like if I give you as a middle manager more freedom and I back you up when you make mistakes because I understand you're learning from them, then you're going to eventually build these skills and you're going to become better at it. And that's going to be good for me and good for you. So of course, that's how you draw it up. Doesn't always work out that way, but I try to do that in my own managerial experience to the extent that I have any. And again, being a good manager in an academic environment is basically just like being a mediocre manager in any other environment. I would say that we in a profession are negatively selected on our ability to manage other people. So it's not a high bar.
We have a question about the role someone plays within the team. How does the role they play, how does that impact the score and the activity?
Great question. I mean, we had to make some tough choices in our experiment. And, as you saw when I briefly told you about what the tasks were, they're pretty simple tasks. And they don't leave a lot of room for that kind of nuance. Like, what about if I play the role of, transcribing what happens, leader versus follower, that kind of thing. I have a follow-up experiment we're doing on leadership, which is trying to understand, you think about the team player effect, like the teams are not hierarchical. So they don't know each other ahead of time and they're all in the same role. Are there people, is the team player effect one thing? Or are there some people who are good leaders and bad followers, or good followers and bad leaders, or vice versa? So we've got a follow-up experiment about to get into the field pretty soon, trying to test that. I think that's a really important future area. And I think it's common sense that there's some role specialty in teams, but I don't have the answer. Hope to someday soon. Maybe the next webinar, I can report that.
Great. We will have you back.
Okay.
We've gotten a couple of questions that I'm going to kind of combine again around the hybrid environment. Some of that data that you mentioned is done pre-COVID. So have you done any experiments in this hybrid world, and are you seeing similarities? And then also kind of how can we adapt the findings to a hybrid environment?
Yeah, so all of our experimental work after this very first team players thing has been online. And I don't have a rigorous answer about whether it matters if you're online or not. I know there was some work by Anita Woolley at Carnegie Mellon and others looking at what they call collective intelligence, which is like how good is a group? Does a group perform better than what you would predict consistently across tasks, which is different than what we're doing, which is about individual team player effects, but it's similar in spirit. And they actually explicitly did an experiment where they compared this effect in person and online and found that there was no difference. In other words, it's true that groups that are good in person are also good online. So I don't know if that's the typical research or comment. More research is needed to nail that down. But I guess I think, my own reflection on it is that Zoom is pretty good for small groups. But I think once you get beyond 4 or 5 people, I think that's when it starts to deteriorate in terms of group interaction. Because there's so much nonverbal communication in person that can happen beyond just a usually two-way conversation that's happening between people, looking at each other, nodding your head, writing something down, seeing if people are understanding. And I think all that is harder to do on Zoom. Whereas when it's just, you and me talking, we get all that. So that's my instinct, but again, it's not proven.
Great. We have a question from an attendee who would like to ask about cognitive endurance. Yeah. They have recently committed themselves to community organizing. And what you said about maintaining focus over time really resonated with them. So how can they build grit for the work of organizing leadership, pursuing a permanent social change on polarizing issues?
Wow, great question. I think for something like that, you're purpose driven. So I think it's really two things. One is there's an actual, the skill of cognitive endurance is just a thing which is, I don't know, maybe a good analogy is how long are you willing to have a conversation or be present in a moment before you pick up your phone and check it? We all do this. It's I'm bored. I'm going to look at can you do that? And I bet all of our ability to do that has degraded in the last 10 years. I know mine has. And so one way to do, and that's just one example, but there's a thing which is just, can I maintain focus on something without needing a break for longer, that I believe is just practice makes perfect. So there's that. But I think when it comes to organizing and advocacy, there's a different thing, which is that's really hard, often thankless work. And you have to really deeply internalize the purpose of it to keep going. And that's larger than just cognitive endurance. That's like, what do I do to wake up every morning and sustain myself and get myself ready for the challenge ahead? You have to really, like when you're having a difficult conversation with someone, or when you fail and you have to get up and try again, like that's when you need something higher than just endurance. You need some larger conviction that the hard work is worth it. And so I think that goes beyond soft skills in an interesting way. But I think if you don't have the cognitive endurance, you probably couldn't do that even if you wanted to. So it's kind of like the intersection of purpose and endurance.
That's great. Thank you. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions here. Can you talk about how decision fatigue might have a correlation or impact on soft skills?
Yeah, definitely. And I think of this cognitive endurance as being a big thing. I mean, I don't know if the question is like, do we want to like build people who never fatigue, or do we want to like change the choice environment so that it doesn't fatigue you as much? And I think the answer is probably both. I think, this is not my expertise, but there's a literature in psychology on what's called cognitive behavioral therapy. And many of you all may have heard of it. Basically, how do you retrain if you have bad habits ranging from violence to substance abuse and things like that? Like, how do you retrain yourself? And these programs work really well by changing your implicit reaction to something. So people develop cognitive habits where, like, when something bad happens, I want a cigarette, or I lash out violently or something. And what happens is, the more times you do that, it's kind of like Michael Pollan in his book about psychedelics has a wonderful analogy about what they do to you, which is like, when we develop habits, it's like if you're going to sled down a hill in the snow and you've done the sledding a bunch of times, there are these grooves or these tracks that you slide into. And the more times you go down the track, the deeper it gets and the easier it is to fall into one of them. And so what you need is some fresh snow to cover the tracks and let you start over. And I'm not advocating for people to do psychedelics, but I think what CBT is, cognitive behavioral therapy, is it's like fresh snow. It says, look, step back, don't fall into the same habits. Why are you falling into those habits? And every time you're in a situation, think deliberately about what action you want to take and what it's likely to lead to. And so it's just reprogramming your mind. And how does that relate to decision fatigue? I think it's because if you just count on yourself never fatiguing, you're going to fall into the same habits. But what you have to do is you have to deliberately engineer your decision environment so that your default is a good choice. And that involves setting your life up. For me, it's like, when we have candy in the house, I put it on the top shelf behind a drawer so I don't look at it. If I don't see it, I don't take it. If it's on the counter, I'll just grab it. So that's like architecting your choice environment so that it's like robust to decision fatigue. So like, I'm not going to take the candy in the morning, partly because, candy in the morning sounds gross, but also like I have a lot of willpower in the morning. I don't have so much willpower when I come home at night. I've had a long day. So it's particularly important for me knowing that I'm going to be decision fatigued, for me not to expose myself to that at the end of the day.